then you could be faced with a situation where the variances are provided, so you don't need to calculate the variances, but you need to use those variances and work backwards to calculate various other information. So let's go and have a look at a lecture example. The management accounts reflect the following variances for June. So first you're given the material price variance. So how do we calculate the material price variance? It's the difference between the actual price multiplied by the actual quantity, and because it's the price variance, the quantity remains the same, and the only thing that we change is the price. So that's how they would have calculated the material price variance. You are then given the total direct labor variance. So if this is the total labor variance, it's the difference between the actual cost and the standard cost. So actual rate multiplied by actual hours, and the standard rate multiplied by standard hours. And just remember, these standard hours over here would be flexed to actual production. Then next, you're given the fixed overhead volume variance. So how do we calculate the fixed overhead volume variance? It's the difference between the budgeted cost and the absorbed cost. Materials are recorded at standard cost. Now that's important because it means that the material price variance is going to be calculated based on the actual quantity purchased. Remember, if materials are recorded at standard cost, then the actual quantity is the quantity purchased. And if materials are recorded at actual cost, then the actual quantity would be the quantity that is used or issued into production. Please remember that this only applies to the material price variance. The material usage variance is always based on the quantity used in production. We are then told that an absorption costing system is used. However, we know that an absorption costing system is used because you've been given the fixed overhead volume variance. Remember, if variable costing is used, we can't calculate an absorbed overhead, meaning that you can't calculate a volume variance. If variable costing is used, we can only calculate a fixed overhead expenditure variance. So if we have a volume variance, it means that absorption costing is being used. You've then been given the budgeted fixed overhead, which is 1,150,000 Rand, and budgeted production is 46,000 units. So if absorption costing is being used, that means the fixed overhead needs to be allocated to products. We need to include the fixed overhead in the value of inventory. So you'll remember I've given you 4 steps that you need to work through when it comes to allocating fixed overheads to products. First, in step 1, we calculate an allocation rate. And you calculate the allocation rate by taking the budgeted fixed overhead, which is 1,150,000 Rand, and we divide by normal capacity. But if normal capacity is not given, you can use budgeted production. So we don't have normal capacity, but we have been given budgeted production of 46,000 units. So we are going to divide by budgeted production. So that gives us an allocation rate of 25 Rand per unit. So that's always step 1. We calculate the allocation rate, and it must always be an allocation rate per unit. Then in step 2, we calculate the absorbed overhead. So how do we calculate the absorbed overhead? We take the allocation rate that we calculated in step 1 and we multiply by actual production. Then the difference between this budgeted cost and the absorbed cost is going to give us the volume variance. You are then told that the standard direct labor rate per hour is 45 Rand. So you've been given the standard rate per direct labor hour. During the period, the purchasing manager acquired 1,200 kilograms of material. So this is the actual quantity purchased. at 426,000 Rand. So that is going to be the actual price multiplied by the actual quantity. And once again, this is the quantity purchased. I know that because it says that they acquired 1,200 kilograms of material at 426,000 Rand. So that's not based on what they've issued into production, that's what they acquired, that's what they purchased. And the division actually incurred direct labor costs of 320,000 Rand. So if that is the actual labor cost, that is the actual rate multiplied by the actual hours. So, in part 1 of the required, you need to calculate the standard price of material per kilogram. All right, so if you look at the variances that we've been provided with, we have the material price variance, the total direct labor variance, and the fixed overhead volume variance. So if we need to calculate the standard price of material per kilogram, this is what we are trying to calculate in the formula. That's standard price over there. So we can use the material price variance that we've been provided with and work backwards to calculate the standard price of material per kilogram. So start by writing out your formula. That's how we calculate the material price variance. Then input all of the information that you have. We know that the price variance is 1,800 Rand unfavorable. So that is your price variance. We know that the actual price multiplied by the actual quantity, and remember, we were told that material is recorded at standard cost, so that means the actual quantity must be the actual quantity purchased. So we take the actual price multiplied by the actual quantity purchased, which is 426,000 Rand. Then we don't know the standard price per kilogram, that's what we are trying to calculate, so that's the unknown. And the actual quantity purchased is 1,200 kilograms. All right. Now you just need to be careful. You need to think about this logically, guys. If this variance is unfavorable, what does that mean? That means that the actual price is more than the standard price. So the actual price must have been higher and the standard price must be lower, because that will result in an unfavorable variance if you actually pay more than the standard price. So what I'm doing in this calculation is I'm taking a high amount or a big amount and I'm deducting a smaller amount, which means this variance must be positive in my calculations. So please note, a common mistake made by students is because the variance is unfavorable, you include this as a negative amount. You need to follow a logical approach over here. If this variance is unfavorable, it means the actual price is higher than the standard price. So it means I'm taking a big amount and I'm deducting a smaller amount, which means this must be positive. All right? If you go back to your lecture notes, you'll see I have included the rule as a shortcut for you. We are busy dealing with a cost variance, not a sales variance. So with cost variances, if the variance is unfavorable, you include it as a positive amount in your calculation. On the other hand, if the variance is favorable, you include it as a negative amount in your calculation. And the sales variances will obviously work in the opposite direction. With the sales variances, if the variance is favorable, you include it as a positive amount in your calculation, and if it's unfavorable, you include it as a negative amount. So I've included the rule for you that you can use as a shortcut, but it's important that you don't just study rules, but you actually understand what you're calculating. So make sure that you can apply the logic that I just discussed with you guys over here. All right, so then the only unknown that we have is the standard price per kilogram. So we now just need to solve for the standard price per kilogram. Remember, when you move this to the other side, the positive amount is going to become negative when you move it across, and this negative amount over here is going to become positive when you move it across to the other side. And we are now just using algebra to solve for the standard price per kilogram. All right, so please just check the logic of that calculation, make sure that you're happy with the logic of the calculation, and you can calculate the standard price per kilogram. Then in part 2, we now need to calculate the number of units that were actually produced in June. So if you go back to the variances that were provided, you need to decide what variance you are going to use to calculate actual production, because actual production was not given. Now you'll remember, we calculate this absorbed fixed overhead by taking the allocation rate and multiplying by actual production. So that means we'll be able to use the fixed overhead volume variance in order to calculate actual production. So first, write down the formula. How do we calculate the fixed overhead volume variance? It's the difference between the budgeted cost and the absorbed cost. Then input all of the information. We know that the variance is 100,000 Rand favorable. We know that the budgeted fixed overhead is 1,150,000. So we can work backwards and we can calculate the absorbed fixed overhead. That's going to be the unknown. Okay, so we were given the variance, 100,000 Rand favorable. We were given the budgeted cost, and we need to solve for the absorbed cost. Now, just be careful. If this variance is favorable, remember this is your volume variance. So if the variance is favorable, it means that actual production is more than budgeted production. So it means that your absorbed cost is higher than your budgeted cost. The budgeted cost must be lower and the absorbed cost must be higher, because that will result in a favorable volume variance. So again, apply the logic. I'm taking a smaller amount and I'm deducting a higher amount. A small amount minus a higher amount is going to give me a negative answer. So this is a cost variance. We are dealing with fixed overhead costs. And because it's a cost variance and the variance is favorable, if you go back to the shortcut, you need to include this as a negative amount in your calculation. All right, so that's the rule, but make sure that you understand the logic. You can then solve for the absorbed cost. Remember, when you take this across to the other side, if it's negative, it now becomes positive, and this is negative, so when you take it across to the other side, it becomes positive. So you've calculated the absorbed fixed overhead. Now, we already said, we know that this absorbed fixed overhead is calculated by taking the allocation rate and multiplying by actual production. So that's how we calculate the absorbed overhead. The allocation rate multiplied by actual production. So if I'm trying to solve for actual production, if you restate the formula, you need to take the absorbed overhead and you need to divide by the allocation rate. So the absorbed overhead is 1,250,000. We calculated that above. We calculated that the allocation rate is 25 Rand per unit. We calculated that previously over here. But you can see the calculation also in the notes. So that means actual production is 50,000 units. And guys, you can test the logic. Test the logic. If you want to now calculate this absorbed overhead, the absorbed overhead is the allocation rate of 25 Rand per unit multiplied by actual production, which is 50,000 units, and that gives you an absorbed cost of 1,250,000 Rand. Also, if you want to prove the calculation of the volume variance, remember the volume variance is the difference between what they actually produced and what they budgeted to produce. So we've calculated actual production to be 50,000 units. What did they budget to produce? 46,000 units. So they actually produced 4,000 units more than what they budgeted to produce. So because actual production is more than budgeted production, this variance is going to be favorable. So we have a variance of 4,000 units, which is favorable. If you want the Rand value of the variance, you need to multiply by the allocation rate, which is 25 Rand per unit, and that gives you the Rand value of the variance. So that ties into the variance that we were given in the question. The fixed overhead volume variance is 100,000 Rand favorable. Then lastly, you need to calculate the standard labor hours per unit. So obviously, if we are trying to calculate the standard labor hours per unit, we can use the total direct labor variance to perform the calculation. because there's the standard hours, which we need to calculate. All right, so first write out the formula for the total direct labor variance. Remember, the standard hours over here are always flexed to actual production. Then we can fill in all of the information that we have. We were given the variance in the question, and it's 17,500 Rand favorable. Now, if the variance is favorable, it means that the actual labor cost must be less than the standard cost. So the actual cost is lower, the standard cost is higher, and that will result in a favorable variance. So if we are taking a lower amount and deducting a higher amount, that is going to give us a negative answer. If you go to the shortcut, we are dealing with cost variances. The variance is favorable, so you need to include it as a negative amount in your calculation. Then, we were given the actual rate multiplied by the actual hours. Here's the actual rate multiplied by the actual hours, 320,000 Rand. We were also given the standard rate. It's 45 Rand per hour. So you can just include all of those amounts in your calculation. And we are trying to calculate the standard labor hours per unit. So the standard hours is the unknown that we are trying to solve for. All right, so just remember, when you move this across to the other side, the negative is going to become positive, and this negative is also going to become positive when you move it across to the other side. And solve for the standard hours. So you get 7,500 hours when you solve. Now just be careful, guys. This has been flexed to actual production. We've taken, how do you calculate the standard hours over here? You take the standard labor hours per unit and you multiply by actual production. That's how we perform that calculation. So please note, you haven't calculated the standard labor hours per unit as per the required. You've calculated the standard hours flexed to actual production or flexed to actual output. So you still need to divide by actual production, which we calculated in the second part of the required, so that you can get the standard labor hours per unit.